Hello everyone. I'm Emily and I'm representing Caravel Bio today. So it may surprise you all that 85% of the vanilla flavoring that we love and know today is made mostly from petroleum. And that kind of other 15%, most of it is made from a wood waste product that's still not considered natural, and really only less than 1% of it's natural. And so as you can see on the right here, companies are committing to sourcing or removing artificial flavors and FDA certified colors from their food. I'm based here in Boston. Dunkin' is committed to removing artificial dyes from all flavors. From all donuts. And this is true for many different companies and many different flavors way beyond vanilla. So let's talk a little bit about how you would make natural vanillin. And vanillin is the precursor and the largest component to make vanilla. So that's called conventional fermentation. So traditionally with fermentation, you have a carbon source, and then you have something called living microbes that are alive and they make the desired product, but they also make waste because they're not perfect machines. And so there's a lot of unspecific products that are produced in addition to vanillin. So when we think about three factors that contribute to the costs, very simply, there's the food, there's the feedstock chemical, and then process costs and inefficiencies. So if you were to buy vanillin made from a bio-based source, it would be around $300 a kilogram. And that's compared to the natural vanillin pod or vanilla pod that can be anywhere from up to $25,000 a kilogram. And so the problem with this and many other sustainable products is that it's just too expensive for people to use. And without driving down the costs, we're going to have a big issue with impacting climate change. And so our technology is an innovation called cell-free systems. So as I mentioned, living microbes make up fermentation. Cell-free is based on a non-living organism or enzymes. And we're doing cell-free systems a little bit differently. And so classic characteristics of traditional cell-free is you have 100% theoretical desired product, and there's really no microbial waste in most cases, and you can recycle these enzymes. So traditionally, cell-free systems are made with enzymes, non-living. And so when you think about the techno-economics of a cell-free system to produce vanillin, we remove the food for an organism because it's no longer living. We can use cheaper feedstocks because our process allows us to break down cheaper products to create natural products. And we remove a lot of these process costs and inefficiencies. So we believe with just this process, we can reduce the cost to around $25 a kilogram. So going a little bit into our technology, we have invented a system called spore display of enzymes. So when we think about cell-free systems, there's kind of two levers to think about for optimum productivity. The first is just how productive is the enzyme at making the desired product, and then how long does the enzyme last? And these are typically two different fields to optimize these efficient machines, material science and synthetic biology. So our system combines all of these into one process step. So the way we do this is we engineer bacteria to make a large amount of desired enzyme. Traditionally, that's how you would do cell-free. The bacteria then assemble an enzyme onto a support structure. So the benefit with an enzyme and the way it lasts longer is that it freezes, and you tether it to support structure, and that's how it'll freeze. And then this cell basically bursts open, and you're left with spore displayed enzymes. And so let's kind of zoom up a little bit and think about how this would work in a bioprocess. So we'd scale our enzyme and support production similar to how you would do enzyme production in traditional fermentation, but we would also do our support structure. Then what we would do is we would do something called continuous stirred tank reactor systems, and then out would come vanillin. So this is compared to, in a traditional process, they'd use something called batch fermentation. And batch fermentation has a lot of process inefficiencies, as you saw in the beginning. But primarily the benefit of continuous reactors is you're spending less money on the actual reactors, so building the systems, but then you are constantly running the system. So you're always getting a product, which allows for less downtime. So when we think about our go-to-market strategy, our vision is to completely redefine the bioeconomy. And as I mentioned before, a big issue with the bioeconomy is just cost. A lot of companies have tried to scale and just ultimately can't compete with petrochemical equivalents. And so that's why all of these products have not been used. So our strategy is to first do pilots with the flavor and fragrance industry using products like vanillin, and we've targeted many others. And then we plan to go into biomaterials, so textiles and plastics, enzymatic mining, and then our kind of holy grail that we see for the very far future in 2040 is to go to creating sustainable aviation fuels and maritime fuels. And so really where we see our value is taking degrading waste products, such as wood waste or plastics, and converting them into low value and high value chemicals. And so quickly, I am Emily. I'm one of the co-founders. I'm an MBA candidate at Boston University. I'm joined not today, but I have a co-founder who's a PhD candidate at Tufts University in biotechnology engineering, and he has been one of the inventors of this technology. And previously, here's my experience. I worked at Google, SIBO, Verily, and Ginkgo Bioworks. And then just briefly, right now, we have demonstrated proof of concept. So what we'll say is feasibility, that this works with various different enzymes to degrade heterogeneous substrates. So those are solids, such as plastic and lignocellulose. But what we're raising is basically to show competitiveness of our system. All right. We'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. It's incredibly interesting what you guys are doing. You said $25 from $25,000 is kind of the target savings.
Yeah, so 25,000 would be if you were buying vanillin from the vanilla pod, and that can usually range from 5,000 to 25,000. It's really determined by climate. So the irony here is that climate's actually killing all of the natural sources of all the ingredients we use. So from oranges to avocados to vanilla. So that's where the 25,000 is. That would be the upper limit. Fermentation, though, is $300 a kilogram, roughly.
Okay, understood. And Puja, you missed last time. So tell us more about yourself and Carbon-13, and then take it away with some questions. Sound good?
Sounds great. Okay, I guess that puts it on me to start with the questions. But I'm Puja. I'm from Carbon-13. We're an early stage climate tech VC, and we also run a really early stage venture builder. So where we bring in founders to come in and start climate tech ventures. And then I run the venture launch pad, which is our accelerator, where we bring in existing kind of early stage climate tech companies, put them through a 10-week accelerator and invest in half of them we put in first checks. So that's us. And our only thesis is that every company we fund needs to have the potential to mitigate 10 million tons of carbon per year at scale. So we have every company that kind of goes through us and pitch us both an investment case and a carbon case. And we're pretty rigorous about, especially the second. And so anyway, I guess in terms of questions for you, I think this is so exciting. I mean, like, wow. I guess I'm curious about what is the exact product that you're selling to, like, so you said you had, fragrance and fragrance and flavor industry. So are you exactly, is it a licensing model? Are you selling the end product to chemical companies as an input? Yeah, like tell me about how exactly your business model works.
Yeah, so initially, and even in the midterm, we would be creating joint ventures. So kind of both. We would bring the underlying kind of technology and the bioprocess, but we would not be selling the chemical to those companies. We'd be creating the chemical with them, but they would be handling kind of the sales of the end product to the next buyer, which would be the flavorists.
So joint
and
venture.
then yeah, exactly. But then in the long term, we do envision us creating our own plant so we can kind of get the whole benefits of our system. Just with the kind of reality of synthetic biology, we know that there's a lot of R&D we have to do and a lot of testing. And so the best way to kind of share in that risk is to pilot it and share in some of the value we can create.
Super exciting. I have some other questions, but I'll let it move on to the others.
I wouldn't mind jumping in real quick because you did mention R&D, and that was big question for me. I'm curious how long and from a time and money perspective, how many resources you have to dedicate to developing a really robust process for one particular flavor. How does that expand to other flavorings? And when you move into fragrances and now you want to move into like bioplastics, is any of that information transferable, or are you starting from scratch each time?
Yeah, so one of our milestones is to build out something called the high throughput selection platform. And what that means is that we can take our spores and enzymes and quickly figure out any variant that works the best in a bioprocess. So, with AI and ML being very big these days, the value here is that the more data we generate ourselves, the more we can put into our algorithms to determine what spore enzyme variants are similar. And the key here with kind of how we get more efficient with generating our products is we plan to use the same feedstock over again. We just might need to change a couple of enzymes in the cascade. So we are targeting products that we can make from lignose. And so that can be vanillin, but there's many other different types of biomaterials we can make. But ultimately, as we get more efficient at that beginning process, the learning just gets faster and faster for other industries. With kind of resources just in terms of people. So right now, we believe it'll take about 6 to 12 months to generate our first kind of competitive product. With over time, with the learnings, our machine should get faster and our algorithms will be more efficient. We can speed up that, but I do think just a bottleneck of this industry is that it does take time to develop, and then those pilots will take a lot of resources just in terms of every bioprocess will be different depending on what we are creating. And so that is something that when we do start these pilots, making sure that we're not just going for everyone who's interested. We are very strategic with, does this fit with our core mission and our vision at the end of the day? And how does it translate to the next research project?
Just to follow up a little bit, had sort of a similar question that you partly answered, but wanted to hear a little bit more around kind of why vanilla flavor fragrances as the beachhead market, and then kind of understanding some of the transferability, of the enzymes, other materials that you're kind of talking through just now, but kind of curious, like, if it sounds like there's sort of like the engineered bacteria, there's like a support structure, and then there's also like the process. I'm sure I'm like way oversimplifying this, but kind of curious. It seems like the bacteria would have to be sort of re-engineered for like each specific enzyme. Curious if like the support structures are similar, if that's something that like once you kind of have like a framework for the support structure, that's a platform you can kind of plug different bacteria in. So just a little bit about like beachhead and then that sort of follow up on sort of transferability.
Okay, so beachhead and then process. So vanillin is it is the most common used flavor and fragrance in the world. And so it's an attractive market from the market size, but then also the cost of it. And so that's why we decided to go for it, because just it kind of makes sense from like this size and quantity standpoint. However, one thing that's a differentiator is that there's only a few companies right now who can actually get that natural label for vanillin, versus right now, most of it is from different sources like eugenol. And so a differentiator for us is that we believe by using lignin, we can still get that natural label and then be able to kind of break the market in terms of cost there. So that was something that really stood out to us. And then in terms of kind of our spore system, and so our spores, just to give a little bit more detail on what they are. So the bacteria we use naturally make these spores. And so what Trevor has done during his PhD is he's characterized the outer shell of the spore. And the outer shell of the spore is made of proteins. And he has basically figured out what are the properties of each protein, and depending on what we need, aka do we need to make our system more thermostable? Do we need to make it more stable against different pHs? He knows what enzymes to put on which anchors and where to put them on those protein anchors. And so to your point of how much does, one product translate? We know the characteristics of the spores. So if you say, hey, we have this industrial process where we would like to speed up the reaction by a higher temperature, Trevor can then do the research and say, all right, well, we know these spore coats, proteins are more thermostable. And so this is the one we will bind it to. And so the kind of properties of the spore don't change. We can optimize it, but the spore is kind of the more consistent part of it.
Super interesting. On kind of going a little bit, you started saying your ideal pilot customer. I'd love to know a little bit more about like who that ideal segment is. I know you had some customers listed on that deck. Are those people that have already kind of signed with you, or you already have conversations with, or are they ideal? And then, and why? And then the second was just kind of, is there any sort of regulatory risk for you all in terms of moving forward, and kind of what's your roadmap on that?
Yeah, so all the customers that I had mentioned there, we've had at least a few conversations with or have gotten some traction. In terms of the ideal pilot partner, it would be someone who has run pilots before and then also has a big focus on sustainability. And so there are many companies that are chemical companies that are just starting to think about sustainability, but they don't have the infrastructure for pilots. So where they fit in is they will buy the end product. So if we would sell vanillin to them, for instance, that's not an ideal partner for us because we would be developing with them. And so the ones that I listed there, ones that have pilot plants, have probably some sort of either fermentation or cell-free capacity and are very interested in renewable feedstocks. And then your second question was, do you mind repeating it?
No worries. It was on the regulation. If you
Okay.
have any regulatory things you need to do.
Exactly. Yeah. So depending on within the flavor and fragrance industry, the biggest two regulations are what deems a product natural and GMO. And based on our research, our product, so Europe is technically the standard here of natural and GMO. From what we've learned, and again, it's a little bit opaque, our product would not be GMO and it would be considered natural. It has to do with how a product is made and the end product being GMO that gives it that status, and there would be nothing GMO in our end product. But that is something within the flavor and fragrance industry that is incredibly important because the whole point is that we can have a natural label and non-GMO. However, within just creating products from lignin, the regulatory landscape is a bit different if we created a biomaterial or something that doesn't go into our food or consumer products, that people are spraying on their body. So it's a little less of a concern as we go down into more commoditized items, but that's a big issue for flavors and fragrances.
Got it. And then I know you said that this is very price competitive with other natural products, but what about the actual petroleum kind of alternative? How cost competitive is it with that?
So the petroleum alternative for vanillin specifically is around $15 a kilogram, 10 to 15. So that was one of the reasons we actually chose vanillin, was because the petroleum product is not, it's still cheaper, but it's not as cheap as plastics, for instance. That's like $1. Yeah. And so the $25 obviously is more expensive. We've talked to people and they've said roughly the green premium is around 20 to 30% where customers are willing to pay. Again, that, I don't know if this was a question, but just kind of getting ahead of it, that is a risk to the business, is, finding out with the customers, like, where is that threshold? And, if we don't make it to 25, if it's at 50, is that still compelling? And so that's some of the further research we need to do, because it is a risk with what are consumers and, the consumer packaged good companies willing to pay. We know that it's 20 to 30%, but is that actually the case?
How much vanillin or vanilla extract are you actually going to need to replace per product? I feel like it's a very, very, very small amount. So the premium would actually not be very much of an increase. Or am I way off on that?
No, you're correct. At the end product, if you're buying vanilla extract that's natural, it's going to be way more expensive. However, in a product like a perfume, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that much of a difference if it's, we're selling it for $25 a kilogram versus 50. That being said, it's more of the flavorists that would be buying it in bulk who are then putting it into the products who are going to be more price sensitive versus then the end consumer, with the exception of vanilla extract, because that's kind of the pure product.
What's to prevent other people from doing very similar things? Is it just the technical expertise that you guys accumulate and continue to accumulate?
Yeah, so from scientific, I'll start from scientific and then I'll go to kind of the business. Obviously so one of our strategies is we have a provisional patent right now that we have exclusive option to license. One of our strategies is that once we spin out, which will happen in May, is filing fundamental platform IP, so that with our spore system, we will patent different variants of different spores from different species. And anytime we put an enzyme on that spore, that is our IP. That's what we will patent. So that's kind of from the protection, the scientific landscape is trying to get background IP as defensible as possible. In terms of product differentiation, I think one thing is cost. That's kind of the whole idea of the bioeconomy, is that there's been these incremental changes, but that's not really moving the market. We need these huge jumps in cost decrease. And so I think that's part of it, is that we will kind of leapfrog fermentation capabilities. The other thing that we are actively thinking of is, and it's honestly the most important part, is what does a product taste like? We were talking to someone and they said, when a consumer buys their ice cream, they want the same experience no matter where they get it. And they don't want vanilla to taste super different from the same brand. And so for us, we're thinking about ways that we can so vanilla is made up of multiple compounds beyond vanillin. So what we're thinking of differentiating is how can we add more natural flavors to vanilla to make it more robust and more interesting and more similar to that Madagascar vanilla bean. And so that's kind of where we think of product differentiation too.
Quick question, kind of coming from the software perspective, definitely interesting to, hear, about the sort of proprietary data around enzymes and anchors, and just kind of curious, imagine that you're going to be gathering data that might be, slightly broader than what you actually end up choosing to commercialize, through a JV or something else. And just kind of curious, if that assumption is right, or if it's super targeted research on the specific things that you're going to be commercializing. If it is right that there will be kind of broader data, are there any sort of thoughts of, licensing the data as part of the business model longer term as well too? Or is it something where it's such a competitive advantage that you keep everything that you're generating in-house? Just curious a little bit how you think about the monetization potential around the data.
Yeah, that's interesting. And honestly, something we haven't really talked about. So we talk about the data from, first we would pull from public sources to do our enzyme discovery. But then as we get more data, bring it in proprietary. I guess what it would come down to is if our data is specifically around our, the software is around our spores and the capabilities there, I would imagine that that's something we would want to keep proprietary, just because that's our core IP, is how we make these spores, and then our manufacturing process that translates to it. But there could be a world where we do, maybe we do have a joint venture with somebody and we would continue selling them the data for different products or something like that. It's a great point that, we haven't talked about much, but it's something that we should definitely consider.
I'm curious, on a different vein, how far you've got in terms of developing the product to date. From what I understand, there's a lot of theoretical understanding of what efficiency could look like, what the price could go down to. Could you share a bit, 100% theoretical sounds incredible. Where are you at today? Timeline to improve that number, and maybe going a bit deeper into the raise and what you're expecting to do with the dollars.
Yep. So just to give you a little more context on what the lift was to even understand the characteristics of the spore. So Trevor's in his 6th year of his PhD, and the Department of Energy synthesized $500,000 of DNA for this research. And so it took, about 5.5 years to thoroughly characterize this whole system. Where we are now is we understand the properties of the system, which is super important because now we have the tools to engineer it to any industrial process. B, we've shown with 4 different classes of enzymes that the enzymes have activity on the spore. So what that actually looks like is that we expose the spore and enzyme to like broken down plastics. It's not the like hard plastic form, but it's kind of the first step to show anyone who's doing plastic degradation would do this first experiment to show like, is there activity? Does this work? So we've kind of checked that box in terms of 4 different classes of enzymes and commercially relevant products or processes, I guess. Within that, we have also understood now how many enzymes we can get on the spore, which is a crucial element to our cost, because the more enzymes, spore combination relates to like the functional unit of productivity. And so that's really important to understand, okay, how many can we get on, and then how many are active? What we are going to do before Trevor finishes his PhD is starting to get some data around scale. So he's done shake flasks, which are very manual, versus kind of going more into what it would look like in that commercial process. And so we're going to start doing that within the next few weeks or months before we fully spin out, and just to get some initial data on it. To your second question on what does the raise look like, we kind of think of this, so we're raising 2 million, and we think of it as taking what these initial proof of concepts are and showing the competitiveness of our system by doing some head-to-head tests against, here's a company and this is the product everyone knows, here's how ours compares. And then we also plan on doing liter scaled reactions. And so that's what all of the partners have said, show this head to head, show the competitiveness, show that you can do liter scaled production, because scale is super important here and one of the bottlenecks of the industry, and show you can do this repeatably with a few different enzymes. And then that is what would be attractive to sign a potential partnership. And so the raise really enables it becoming a commercial product and process.
And if I can clarify, have you been able to produce vanillin to date?
No. So what we have done is shown that with cellulases that we can break down that feedstock. Vanillin, I believe, uses 3 different types of enzymes. So we've done kind of the initial breaking down the feedstock, which is actually one of the hardest parts of it. And then in the future, once we spin out, we will show the other kind of remaining conversion. And to your point, that is also something that we would need to show, is even if it's just a small sample, get that to these partners, and then they would give it to their end customers to kind of get an idea of, one, the unit economics for the partner, but then what it even kind of smells like for a customer. So that's something that we are thinking about too, is showing a little bit of that end product.
Yeah, I can see how valuable that would be, especially, you're going with the JV option, which is nice and light from your manufacturing point of view, but then puts a lot of onus on having a good partner in order to get to scale. So they need a lot of information up front before they can commit to investing so much and working with you.
Yeah,
that's helpful. Thank you.
Do you have any of those folks that are, that you've been speaking to? Have you lined them up as potentially like strategic partners in some of this, like these next R&D steps? That's, I guess, one question. And then the other was just like, I think you said this already, but what are the feedstocks? And is there any kind of concern with like supply of them? I know they're way cheaper in this case, so it's not like glucose like it is with precision fermentation, but tell me about what it is here.
Yeah, so in terms of partnerships, we're still very early here. We've progressed conversations to a point where they've said, we've talked to their technical teams, we've talked to the right people, and they've basically said, we need to see these data points to continue this conversation. And so as our paper comes out and as we spin out, those will be continuous conversations. But right now we're kind of at the standstill of, we need more data for them to invest more time with us. The second point is what feedstocks. So we primarily will use lignocellulose from the forestry industry and plastics. Plastics will be kind of the second, lignocellulose will be the first. In terms of issues with kind of the supply chain, there's kind of two answers to this. So lignocellulose is made of lignin and cellulose. Lignin is a waste product in the paper and pulp industry. And this is a little bit different from for the vanillin route, but let's say we're going, our second product, our third product is biomaterials. One of the issues with scalability in this whole industry is it's not cost effective to actually degrade the lignin. And so people are just either throwing it away. It's hard to find offtake agreements. Many companies burn it for steam or for energy, but they don't need to burn it all. So there's kind of this issue with what do we do with our lignin? And we've talked to paper and pulp companies about this. If we are able to show that we can cost effectively degrade lignin and create products, the supply of lignin is there. It's just the being able to do it cost effectively has been the big issue. Within lignocellulose, that is a concern, especially when you're thinking about biofuels, because the volumes you need are so astronomical. That's why we're not going that direction first. The strategy of doing high value chemicals is that we can make an impact, a meaningful impact with lower volumes. And so there's still a concern with the supply chain. One more thing, and then I'll kind of stop there, is that lignocellulose can come from a bunch of different sources. One of the issues within like the biofuels V1 back in early 2000s was that they were using corn waste, which is not very dense. And so the transportation costs and breaking down were just so inefficient. Wood waste is a lot denser and more efficient. And so in addition to lowering the transportation costs, there's kind of this whole movement towards distributive biomanufacturing, placing the biomanufacturing right by the forests. And so those are a couple of ways that we're going to kind of, we think about getting around that potential issue.
Got it. And then, sorry, one last question was on the lignin. You mentioned that this is like a problem. If you are able to do something cost effectively, is that a new potential source of revenue for you? Have you thought about that as well?
Yeah. So the lignin is actually what makes the vanillin. The cellulose
I meant getting rid of it. Sorry, like taking it off of the paper company's hands that they currently are struggling to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what of recently more paper companies are starting to, because as I said before, they're either burning it for energy. And so now they're trying to think of how can we be more strategic with this? And so that is a huge problem. And they're trying to think of, do we make our own chemicals? Do we just sell it? Who do we sell it to? And so that is a problem that they're looking into that we are trying to solve.